Well, good morning, church. How are we doing today? You know, I'm going to be honest with you real quick. First service really kind of did about that good. It was good. I'm proud of you. You did a great job, but they were extra spunky today. So may need a little bit more engagement because I'm kind of a rookie at this, right? No, but my name's Ryan. I've been here for a long time. Me and my family, we've been around. And it's needless to say that, one, we love this faith community. I know that's kind of a churchy word, but we really love this faith community. It's been a part of our lives for over a decade, and I've built some amazing relationships. My kids have built some amazing relationships, so we love it here. So just number one, we come from a place of love. This passage comes from a place of love. Secondly, I always give a disclaimer at the beginning of my messages. Number one is that, the only real disclaimer I'll give you is that I don't get up here as an expert. It's important that you know that. Like, I'm not a theologian. I don't have a PhD. I don't have the MDiv, all that stuff. I'm perfectly fine with that. It's awesome for those that do. But my philosophy of Bible teaching is much different. It's much less instructional and very much more relational and conversational. And what I mean by that is that when I teach a passage of the Bible, I'm going to get in it and I'm learning it. And then what I want to do is get up here and we do it together. And we learn it together. And God does what God does, and He reveals truths and principles and all those things. But I don't come up here as an expert. I come up here as a co-learner in Jesus. That's kind of that's the language that I always use, that we are co-learners in Jesus. So I got a question for you, and I don't want to confuse you. So I confused the last service, probably because it wasn't a very good question, but we're going to tweak it a little bit and give you a little explanation. I'm going to ask a question about wasting time, but I don't mean like being lazy, like on the couch, right? Because I love that. I'm a big fan of sitting on the couch and doing nothing. By the way, front row, I'm so sorry. I'm spitting a lot today for some odd reason. I noticed it all last service, and somebody asked for a face shield and everything. But no, but I don't mean like being lazy, right? I love lazy time. I'm fantastic playing video games with the kids or just doing whatever. I mean like you walk away from something and you're like, that was a complete waste of my time. How many people really enjoy that feeling? Anybody? We had some last service that really said, I thought it was weird, but whatever, right? Like, we really, as a culture, hate wasting our time. Like, have you ever been, somebody's like, oh, God, you got to go see this movie, bro. You got to go see this movie. Oh, yeah, should I go see this movie? Yeah, I'm going to go see. So I go to this movie, and I'm like, I'll never get that 2.5 hours of my life back. What the heck are you doing? Why did you tell me to go see the movie? It was awful, right? Like, we get really tore up about it. Like, oh, man, you got to go to this restaurant. It's so good. Go eat this restaurant. And I go there, and I'm like, but I ordered my steak medium rare, and they handed it to me well done. This is not a good experience. It was terrible food. It was a terrible experience, right? Nobody likes it at all. We can't help it. Everything that we hear at work is all about efficiency and effectiveness and don't waste time. And we're looking for the most efficient people. We want to teach you how to be more efficient and effective. And that's all really good. But today, the passage we're going to work with uses this word, or this phrase, being in vain. As something that's an utter and complete waste of our time. And the things here's what I do know, is that the things that are deeply personal, or even deeply spiritual, we tend to emotionally connect to those things. And when we walk away from these experiences that we're expecting to be beautiful and we're expecting to be great and we're expecting to be maybe monumental in our life, and we walk away and it was all vain or done in vain, and we're left with a really bad taste in our mouth. Now, the reason I say that is because last week we had this really cool Sunday, Next Step Sunday, to where, we hopefully helped people learn, here's how you can take next steps to belonging here at One Life Church or at One Life Henderson. Here's how you can take steps. We have groups, we have some teams. We had all that in the lobby. If you missed out on it, guess what? That's all still here, and we can get you there. We want you to be there. But here's what I want to make sure we at least own up front, and we're honest about up front, right? Like, everybody signed up, or a lot of people signed up to go to these groups and jump in on these teams and do all these things. And as I was really preparing and processing for this message, I came across these moments in history when I would show up to things like life groups, or show up to like my first worship practice. I remember showing up to my first worship practice, and I'm like, I really, really hope these people don't think I'm terrible. Like, I love guitar. I've been playing and singing for a long time. Like, everybody's told me, I'm good. Well, when I say everybody, I mean my mom. She told me how good I was or whatever. But I remember showing up. I was super insecure and super anxious. Like, holy smokes, like these people are going to think I'm a terrible singer and a worse guitar player, and I don't even know how I'm going to deal with it. Like, there's this level of angst, and if you show up to a group, I remember one of the first group experiences I've ever had in my entire life was we showed up, and when I showed up, we quickly realized that we weren't allowed to bring people to this group. And I was like, what? Like, that's kind of what we do. Like, me and my wife, I want people to know Jesus, and I showed up, and there was this really awkward moment to where I was like, I can't come back to this group. I love you, but I can't come back here because we want to bring people to a group. But those moments are wrought with some angst and some struggle, if I'm being honest. It's a moment I signed up to go to a group because somebody told me that it was going to be a life-altering experience. And the first one that I showed up to was not a positively life-altering experience. That's possible. And I don't mean that negatively, right? And we'll get more to that later. But when you're anticipating or expecting God to show up or expecting these monumental moments in your life, and you walk away saying, man, that was just a waste of my life and my time, it can kind of bear down on you. So this passage that we're going to deal with today is 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 58. And I want to read the passage to you first, and then we're going to do some work. By the way, I also hope, my goal, and I may fail at this utterly, but I want to try really hard, is I want you to walk away knowing how to approach studying a passage of the Bible. Like, that's really, I'm really passionate about that. Doing this type of stuff changed my life. There we go, spin again. Doing this stuff really changed my life, so I will do that. I will give you tools, things, I'll say little things that popped in my head that people have taught me in the past. So I want you to know how to change, or to study the Bible. But this is 1 Corinthians 15:58. It says, therefore, my brethren, and that sounds like a weird word, it just means brothers. Therefore, my brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in your work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. I'm going to read that again. Therefore, my brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in your work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So, number one, studying the Bible. This is the tip number one that I'm going to give you. I'm going to start out as a cliche, and then I'll explain it. But if you see the word therefore, I'm too short to reach it, but if you see therefore in the Bible, flags need to go up in your brain. Because that word essentially means, hey, this is what's coming is a practical steps. Here's some practical things that you can do to reinforce whatever was just read about in the previous chapter or chapters or book or whatever. That therefore is really, really important. And the cliche is, what's the therefore, right? That's how as pastors, that's how we say it. What's the therefore? Why is it there? Because there are different ways you can read that word depending on the passage that you're reading. And in this one specifically, I've got a slide. We're going to reword it this way. Instead of reading it therefore, you can also read because of Jesus' resurrection. And it would read like this. Because of Jesus' resurrection, my beloved brethren, however you want to say that, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in your work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Okay? Now, the whole chapter 15 in the book of Corinthians is all about the resurrection, right? That's why I added in the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the whole book, if we back it a little bit farther, the whole book of 1 Corinthians is a letter from a guy named Paul written to a city named Corinth. Now, Corinth is very much appropriate comparison to our modern day world. Very much forward-thinking, high levels of high economy. There was a big business there from all over the world was in Corinth. Very diverse in thought, very diverse in race, very diverse in culture in general. So these people in Corinth would have been wrestling through, man, how do I live my faith out? How do I explain my faith? How do I understand my faith in a culture that may not welcome it completely, or at least will have some challenges to it? And the entire 2 books of Corinthians are kind of written to this church that's existing in the midst of this city that doesn't exactly welcome their viewpoints on all things, on all of reality. And so Paul uses his gift of writing and explaining and all that stuff, and he writes and he says, hey, here's how you do this, here's kind of how you do church, here's this type of stuff, here's the resurrection and what it is, that's chapter 15. Here's all these things on how to do life, how to do church, how to do all of that. And in chapter 15, Paul's making sense of the idea of resurrection, right? And I didn't do this last service, but I need to do it this service. It's important that you understand what we're saying. Like, we did my mom's funeral back in 2021, I believe, right? 2020. And we had a ceremony here. We've done lots of funerals in my life, my journey, but I think we need to make sure we understand exactly what we say when we're saying resurrection from the dead. Like, it's hard to wrestle with. Like, we've been kind of conditioned to the language here in Midwestern America. It's hard to understand, like, there's an actual corpse that has life. And not just any life, but like this newness of life, this levels of restoration, like we can't even comprehend. Like, it's hard for us to even navigate it right here as we're doing this thought process. You can imagine however many thousand years ago that these primitive people were trying to explain it and make all these explanations of Jesus and what happened with the resurrection. They had a hard time grasping a hold of it. And it was a point of contention. The resurrection was a point of contention in the ancient world because it was not a common thing. I mean, it happened, but it was not a common thing. And especially a corpse without somebody saying, come alive or get up or whatever the words are that you say. I've never done it, so I don't really know, right? But there's very few moments, and Jesus is the only one to ever do it by his own power, right? And this is the reality that Paul's writing into. Groups of people say, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. No, he didn't resurrect from the dead. He just kind of, did this type of thing. Or somebody, was playing a prank, or somebody was trying to trick you or fool you. There's all these explanations, and Paul's writing to give us clarity on the resurrection in this chapter. And he says in verse 2, he uses this word vain as well. Verse 2, I think 14, he talks about how if the resurrection of Jesus did not happen, then everything that we're doing, everything I'm writing to you is in vain. It's worthless. It's meaningless, and it's a waste of time. That's a big deal. Like, it's a really big deal. And you know what that means? Because back in that day, if somebody would have been like, hey, by the way, here's the body, bang, it's over. Here's the body of Jesus, the belief system's gone. That's what Paul's saying, is the entire the foundation of the Christian faith rises and falls on the resurrection of Jesus. And what Paul does in chapter 15, man, I really want to preach it, but I can't. But what he does is he logically helps people understand, here's how this happened, and here's the proofs that kind of go with it. He explains why it matters, and he explains why it's plausible and reasonable to navigate it as reality, something that actually happened. And he hinge points and says, in my words, if it didn't happen, then everything we do is meaningless. But if it did, then it changes everything. Everything. Everything about the way you walked in here, everything about the way you view your spouse, everything about the way you approach this church, everything in your life is affected if Jesus actually did what he said that he did. And Paul's making the case for it, and we've been using it for thousands of years to reinforce the notion and the idea that Jesus did exactly what he said that he did when he resurrected from the grave. So you got this Genesis 15 discourse on the resurrection, and he finishes the whole thing off. I'm going to read it again because I want to pound it in your brain, right? I'm not going to say therefore. I'm going to say because of Jesus' resurrection. And he finishes the whole discourse on the resurrection. Here he says, because of Jesus' resurrection, my brothers, be steadfast, be immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord, your labor is not in vain. So in this case, the therefore has us go back and look at, so because Jesus rose from the grave, here's the three things, ooh, I caught that down. Here's the three things that you're going to need to be. So essentially, as followers of Jesus, everything that we are is built on the resurrected Jesus. So that means that our lives, essentially, we're figuring out how are we going to live lives that respond to the resurrection of Jesus. And I'm going to call that living the resurrected life. Okay? That's kind of the working title of this sermon. I'm open for options. If you got a better idea, that's great. But that's what we're going to work with. The goal, or kind of what Paul's saying, is he's saying, hey, here's how you live a resurrected life. And he gives us three examples. And the first one is steadfast, to be steadfast. You know, there's not a whole lot of language things that we can do here, but I do think we want to look at them to make sure we understand, because the first two are similar, but they're different. So the steadfast would be something that's fixed, something that's stable. Right? So because of the resurrection of Jesus, be stable, be steadfast, be fixed in your approach. And what I don't mean by that is that be 100% unteachable. And I don't mean that your viewpoints have to be so concrete and hard that you can't learn anything from somebody that disagrees with you. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that when it comes to approach of being fixed or stable in our belief system, I think sometimes that can be as simple as engaging the real questions that we have, if we're honest. Like when nobody's around, are the real questions that we ask about the Bible, or the real questions that we ask about God, or the real questions we ask about churches, or whatever that means, sometimes producing some steadfastness and can be answering and engaging those real questions. Because Jesus loved them. Man, he loved those questions. He loved those conversations. I know it. God's not afraid of them. He wants you to ask them. You know why? Because he wants you to live a resurrected life. So steadfastness is this idea of being fixed or being stable. The second one's immovable. Similar concept, right? But it's more like an unshakable. And I guess the image that I had in my brain was, anybody like construction-minded type folks in here? Oh, man, am I the only one? Okay, that's weird. Oh, I got a couple hands. There we go. Don't be shy, guys. Wake up, right? So I just imagined if I had a 2x4 and I put it on the floor, right, and I either used what's called tap cons or the concrete screws or some powder actuated. It's like a little bullet-looking thing that shoots a nail into concrete. If I use one of those two things to fasten that thing to the ground, it's not going to be very shakeable, right, initially. But what happens if I take a hammer and start banging on the side of it? Anybody know? It shakes loose. So technically it is shakeable, just not by my weak hands. You guys could probably shake it, I bet, can you boys? Right? So unshakable is this notion that even if you do start taking hammers to your belief system, or taking hammers to how you view the world, or your understanding of the God of the universe, that even if you do take hammers, it's not that it won't rattle you a little bit, it's not that it won't not feel good, but it's that you're immovable in the sense of, okay, this hurts, this is terrible, but here's what the God of the universe has to say about this situation in this moment. Right? We're not defined by our instability, and we're not defined by being unshakable, that we're defined by the things that are immovable and steadfast, which is Jesus. Right? So steadfast and immovable, and the third one is the one I really want to spend the most of our time on, and that's abounding in the work of the Lord. Now there's two kind of ideas that this has. One, I had a water bottle last time, I don't have. But you imagine I have a full cup of water right here. It gets all the way to the top. Every move I make, what's going to happen? It's going to spill out, right? All over everything. Right? It's not necessarily going to be a bad thing, although it kind of looked like I had an accident earlier when I spilled it on myself, right? But when I'm moving around here, that cup is so filled, it's overfilled to the point that everything I do is end up going to spill out on me or other people around me. Right? This is an abounding in the work of the Lord type mentality. This is that we're so full of these things. Like the resurrected life is full of, it's overfilled by the work of the Lord. Right? It's not your work, it's his work that we do, that type of stuff. That number one, that spills out on other people. But the other side of it, the other part of this word is about exceeding a goal. It's about excellence. It's about setting targets on the work that God's called you to and surpassing them, like surpassing those targets and those goals, and you're exceeding them. So it's this idea of doing well and doing the work of the Lord with excellence. So what Paul essentially is saying to us all is like, hey, to live the resurrected life, Be steadfast and immovable. Understand where your identity is from, right? Understand that you're not defined by the hammers that hit you. You're not defined by anything outside of the gospel. And number two is we want to go and do things as if we're doing them for the Lord. We want to run an abounding work of the Lord to where we are exceeding goals and we're doing more than we've ever thought about being possible. Better than we ever thought about being able to do it. Living the resurrected life. Sorry, I lost my place here. Be steadfast and immovable. So, how many people in here know somebody that you feel like you would say, not they would say, you would say they live a resurrected life? Like they do the whole Christian thing right. Raise your hand. Everybody's got somebody, right? Okay. Everybody knows somebody they feel like does it right or does it well or somebody that does it how you would like to do it. Big idea for the day. Here's a big idea for the day. Every single person that you feel like walks out their faith well and lives a resurrected life has learned how to. I'll say it again. Every single person that you would say walks around here living a resurrected life has learned how to. They've botched it. They've failed. The people that walk around their house with them every day know that just isn't, that they didn't wake up born living out this ideal following of Jesus. Like they just didn't do it. Like I know sometimes those of us that get on the stage are kind of pictured in this sense, in this place of to where we all kind of have it together, right? And then we all do things right. And we don't really screw up. The problem is you haven't spent enough time with us. That's kind of how that works, right? You know, like I've spent some time, pretty some significant time with people in this room, and you fully understand that I'm not some ideal person every time of my life. I really, really want to be. It's who I want to be. It's who I aspire to be. But if I'm being honest with you right now, every other person on the stage that has a microphone and leads would tell you the same thing. That there are moments to where we wake up and we just wonder if it's not all in vain. Maybe. I'm not talking about my faith in Jesus. I'm pretty stable and immovable there in most capacities. But sometimes I have to ask myself, are the things that I'm doing, do they even matter? Are they making a difference? And so from a practical standpoint, what we need to do is we need to say, okay, what are some ways that we can move towards establishing being more steadfast, more movable, and growing in that, and more abounding in the work that God's called us to, right? And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to need to walk with Jesus, right? We're going to need to walk with Jesus. I think there's another slide up here, the walk with Jesus slide. Secondly is we're going to have to we're going to invite others to the journey. There we go. To follow with us. And three, we want to remember the resurrection daily. Now, what do I mean by this? Walk with Jesus. That sounds simple. Well, it actually technically is pretty simple, right? In essence. It's not, it is very simple in the same sense that, learning how to be fit or lift weights. That's not rocket science per se. It's as simple as it's ever been. It's not, the hard part's not doing it. The hard part is not understanding how to do it. The hard part is getting my lazy butt out of bed to go do it. That's the hard part, right? So there's if you've ever done anything or tried to walk with Jesus consistently, it's not that it's complex in its nature. We make it complex. And I want to use an example from the Bible. There's a guy named Peter in the Bible. And I think a lot of times we unfairly pick on Peter as though he's some kind of ignorant dude, right? He's just kind of an idiot. And he does some bonehead things, don't get me wrong, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? It's not that. Peter's journey was actually pretty interesting. Jesus calls him as a disciple, as a pretty young guy, not as young as his cohorts and the disciples, but he calls him as a pretty young guy. He would have been the oldest. Jesus kind of made him the leader of this pack, of this group of disciples. He said, hey, man, you're going to be the leader. So he goes on to do some crazy stuff and goofy things that we like to look back on, or I like to look back on and kind of make fun of. But then when Jesus is being crucified or about to go be crucified, there's a really interesting story that happens with Peter. See, Peter's approaching a courtyard, and everything surrounding Jesus would have been not good, right? And everybody associated with Jesus would have been it wouldn't have been okay. Probably wouldn't have been safe. They may have been turned in. Who knows what the real repercussions of that were. So Peter's sitting in this courtyard, and somebody walks up to him and is like, hey, bro, you're with that dude that they're about to hang on the cross. You're with Jesus. And Peter's like, no, wasn't me. Not me, right? That's the first one. Then they kept looking at him like, bro, you're one of his followers. And Peter's like, no, he gets amped up, gets angry. He's like, no, I am not, right? There's the exclamation point on the text. I am not one of his followers. Until this third time he comes, he goes, no, I know that you are with Jesus of Nazareth. And that's when he loses his lunch and like cusses these people out. Like in the Hebrew, it was bad language. It was not good language that Peter used, saying, I am not with this guy. And in that moment, he remembers that Jesus had said, hey, before this rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times, right? And here's what we often forget or don't know about that moment. We need to understand in the culture of Jesus and Peter, there is no bigger sin, no bigger mistake that you could ever make than denying your rabbi publicly in front of people. Denying that you're his follower. There is not a mistake that exists that's bigger or more troublesome or more of a failure than that one. So we fast forward, Jesus, goes through the crucifixion and he gets resurrected, and he comes back and he says, hey guys, I need you to go get the disciples and Peter. Read it. It's in one of the Gospels. Hey, go get the disciples and Peter. And here's what's important about that. I can't even begin to explain how big of a deal that is. I mean, adultery, all the big Christian sin things that we talk about all the time, any of that is not bigger than this one. This is the biggest deal in the world. And Jesus comes back from the dead, and evidently Peter has walked away from the disciples, or they booted him out or something. Something happened, and Peter was no longer considered to be one of the apostles. But you know what Jesus does? Jesus calls his name. Jesus calls his name and he says, go to the disciples, and Peter. And you know what happens to Peter in the long run? Peter wakes up the next day, and guess who's in charge of the church? The next couple of days, Jesus says, hey man, not only are you back reinstated as a disciple, despite your public intoxicating or your public toxic move that you just made, but I'm going to make you the head of the church. On you, I'm going to do this, and it's going to be on you. And my friends, I don't know that we understand the gravity of it, because I don't care what you did yesterday. I don't care what you did last year. I don't care what you've done ever in your entire life. The God of the universe is calling your name. Like he's calling your name. And he's not calling you to come be perfect. He's not asking you to do anything right. He's asking you just to do something. He's called you to something. And he took the biggest screw up possibly in the history of mankind, and he gave him a place of leadership and authority and love and belonging and purpose. And it didn't matter. Do you see what we're doing here? Anything that is done in the name of Jesus in the kingdom of God, however you want to say it, will never return void. It will never be in vain. It will always come back. And I don't care how hard the hammer hits you and it hurts. I don't care how bad. I do care, but it doesn't matter how bad it hurts. It's going to hurt. God will meet you in the moments because he's called you by name. And he said, my child, you don't have to pretend. You don't have to be perfect. He meets you where you are. And we get lost and we forget that so often. And we get wrapped up in all the nonsensical things like trying to be a better Christian. How absurd is that? I'm sorry. I say things pastors aren't supposed to say. He's not called you to be a better Christian. He just called you to show up and say yes. He's called you to receive the things that never come back in vain. You will never waste your time when you're serving the Lord Jesus. So here's the thing. If you signed up for a kids team or a group or whatever, I don't know, like whatever God moved on you or you moved on you, it doesn't really matter what you signed up for. Here's what I want you to know, is that God's calling your name, and He's got something for you in this earth to do. I don't care if you're 6, I don't care if you're 106, it really doesn't matter. God's got a purpose for you. And you may not know what that is. And you may love kids and think it's kids or think it's whatever. But you may never know what He's called you unless you go back in here to a kids team and you experience Christ-centered community in such a way that you meet the God of the universe in such a way that He gives you something to do. He gives you a meaning and a purpose for this life. Or you may never know unless you step on the stage and play guitar at some point. You may never know if you don't on a guest services team. You may never know unless you're making coffee and in this community. You may never know what the God of the universe has. You may never hear His name being called if you're not a part of a Christ-centered community. You may not. And yes, there is potential for it to suck and have some bad things happen. That's possible. It is. And I'm sorry. Sorry. As we are journeying through our walk with Jesus, as we are doing everything that we can do to live a resurrected life, you've got to remember, we have to remember, and I need to be reminded of this. You hear me? I need to be reminded of this. Is that everything is fueled, all of it is fueled by the resurrection of Jesus. So we walk with Jesus every day. We can figure that out. I mean, there's all kinds of spiritual disciplines out there that I'm sure they work. I don't know, some of them may not. I don't know. There's a lot of things. I can't read the Bible. Yes, you can read the Bible. It's going to take you a while to understand it. But I started out reading it, 20-something years ago, and I didn't understand the words that came out of it. I've asked a lot of really dumb questions and said a lot of really wrong things from stages like this until I learned better. Right? So, thank you. Walk with Jesus somehow, some way. Jesus invited Peter back to be a part of the crew, part of the team. Walk with him. Bring people on the journey with you. Invite others to follow Jesus with you. Like the world needs to know, by the way, that Christians aren't perfect. Like we've been parading ourselves as though we're perfect for long enough. Like it's absurd. Like they need to know that you don't know things about the Bible. They need to know that you don't know things about doctrine. They need to know that you don't know things about Jesus. They need to know that you wake up every day and have issues. People need to know that. People need the community to understand, here's how I conquered my addiction. Here's how I navigated my bad marriage. Here's how I navigated. And it's not because of anything that I've done. It's all because of who Jesus is, and I'm trying really, really hard to live a resurrected life. And that spills out on other people. Invite people to the journey. And if you don't have anybody to invite, jump in one. Invite yourself. I do it all the time. I'm serious. I call random people that I say, hey, can I buy your lunch? And I ask you 3 questions. I do it all the time. I buy somebody's lunch for $30 and then ask 3 questions. Like, do it. Invite people or jump into people's journey. And the last one is remember the resurrection every day. Right? Remember the resurrection every day. If Jesus didn't return from the grave, if He didn't resurrect from the dead, our faith is futile. It's vain. It means nothing. But if He did, then it changes every dynamic of who you are, all the way down to the molecular level. Young men and women in here that are at the high school, if Jesus is who he says he is, if he did what he says he did, guess what? It changes everything about you. It changes everything about how you see your peers. It changes everything about how you see your school. It changes everything about how you approach your future. It changes everything that you are. Everything that you do is impacted by the resurrection of Jesus. Everything. All of it. The reasons that you give, the reasons that you show up here, it's all impacted by the resurrection of Jesus. How you handle yourself at work, how we do those things, it all matters. But it takes us waking up every day and being reminded that the God of the universe gave his son for me so that I can be in right standing for him. And sometimes every day, I would say for me, I need to be reminded of my place on this planet. And that's the place. As humanity, we were created in the image of God. We were the only thing created, and God said it is very good. Because we've been given his image. And things have been made right. So now we get the opportunity to show the world this resurrected living, this resurrected life, what it is and the impact that it can have. The question is not, is it there or is it an option? The question is, are we progressing and moving forward in it? That's the question. And I think it ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's yes for me, sometimes it's no. It's fine. It's okay. I'm out of breath and I'm sweating a lot. But I didn't spit as much as I did last service. That's a big deal. So what do we do now? Well, number one, take a picture or write those 3 things down because I want you to figure out what they are. Like in your life, what are the things? Like what would help you walk with Jesus? Like, are you trying to do this thing alone? Listen. There's not one data point on planet Earth of research that's been done that will say you're better alone. Not one. It doesn't exist. You were created to be in community with other people and with God, period. We were created out of the overflow of the Father, Son, and the Spirit. It's perfection. That's what we aspire to, and that's what we long for. We'll never experience it on this planet, but you are not intended to do this thing alone. You don't have to be in hundreds of people, but you are built for community. Period. And it takes all kinds. And we want to figure out what remembering the resurrection looks like for you. What does it look like? I mean, I've heard people talk, they'll get up and read the crucifixion story and the resurrection story a whole lot. They do that all the time, a couple times a week, because they just need to be reminded of the good news that comes from it. The gospel message is that Jesus died, right, and rose again so that we can be in right standing with a holy God. And sometimes that's hard to believe and hard to grab a hold of in the midst of when things are hard. That's when we can be in community and we can remind one another of the beauty of the message. So walk with Jesus, invite others to follow with you, and remember the resurrection. Deal? Let's pray. God, you're good. God, I thank you for life and love and hope and mercy and peace. And God, I thank you so much for the message that you have, for the reality that Jesus is who he says he is, the reality that Jesus rose again from the grave. And so God, I pray that we would be a people that are not trying to just be better Christians and better at coming to church and all that stuff, but God, we are trying to connect with the God of the universe, that we are walking this thing out to the best of our ability, but on your terms. God, we trust you with the journey, with the process, but I pray that you would bring people into our lives that we can connect with. God, I pray that you would give us the audacity to step out in faith in areas that we know we've been needing to step out there. God, I pray that you would give us the faith, the courage to know that regardless of what we do, that you're sitting there waiting, that you're sitting there waiting to love and serve and point and guide. And I'm just grateful for it. So God, we just want to take a minute and we just want to sing and ask for healing where healing needs to be there. Maybe ask for clarity where clarity needs to be. Or God, we just lay it before you understanding fully that we don't know it all. We want to be people of the cross. We want to be people of the word. We want to be people of the good news of Jesus. So help us to walk it out. Give us people to do it with. Help us to remember the resurrection every single day of our lives. That's in the beautiful name of Jesus I pray.